Thank you all for coming to this meeting. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving break. But if you're new to our club, we're the Web Development Club, and we teach web development related skills to Virginia Tech students. So this is going to be our last meeting of the semester, and we're going to cover React.js, which is a really popular front-end JavaScript framework. So I'll be covering the basics of React with the Hook API. So the basic agenda for this meeting is just going to be me introducing React with some slides. And then after that, we're going to build a simple to-do list with React. But you only need to like focus on the important parts of the application. So I'm going to be providing you with the boilerplate template, which you can clone from the GitHub repos that I just shared. But don't worry about that for now. I'll go over it in a little bit. But make sure that you have Git and Node.js installed on your computer. Um, okay, so, and then after that, there's going to be like a Q&A session where you can like ask any questions that you may have. But feel free to like post any questions in the chat box or just unmute yourself. Yeah. So, so what is React? React is a JavaScript library created by Facebook, and it is used for creating user interfaces for front-end applications. So it isn't actually a framework, although um, it looks like it, but it doesn't like come with some of the features that a framework provides, like the router and also other things. And I think React is really popular in the industry right now, but the Vue.js is also like picking up the speed. But there's also the Angular framework. Yeah. So why use React? So React can make your front-end JavaScript much easier. So React uses self-contained independent components with their own state. So you're able to wrap the data within a component. So it makes your code much more modular, and it's like easy to read and collaborate. Um, and React also uses JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML. And it basically lets you write HTML inside your JavaScript. Um, so what should you know before learning React? So you should have known the basics of JavaScripts, such as object literals, arrays, and conditional. And it may also help you to learn JavaScript destructuring, like ES6 features, and also like higher order array methods, like the for each function, map, and filter, and also a JavaScript promise. And I'll be using array functions during like when we're building the to-do application, but you can also use the functional, like use the function keywords. That's also fine. So let's talk about like how React works. Um, so, um, so React has this basic workflow where you you display some data on a web page, and a user can like interact with your web page, and and the user interaction can trigger some kind of data changes. Um, so when that data changes, your web page will get re-rendered and it's going to look differently. So so this is like the basic workflow. So everything like happens automatically once you define components. So you don't have to like manually update your UI. So that happens automatically whenever you update um, your data, which is your state or your props, which I'll go over a little bit. Um, yeah. So, so it is really important to get into the habit of like breaking down your UI into individual components when you're working with React. So each component is going to be responsible for displaying itself based on the external as well as the internal state, internal data available. So if you were to break down a to-do list application, you would have a container at the as the first component, and then inside that you would have a search bar and a list of to-dos, and inside that list you would have to-do item. So if you're building a to-do list, you would want to break each of these section of this to-do list application into a component so it is much more modular and easier to work with. So if you do it this way, you would have a tree of components for a full UI. And each component can have its own data. So this is another example of a to-do list. So as you can see, we have a header, a list of to-dos, and we can also like delete them and check them. And we also have a input field where we can like add a new to-do. So if we were to break this apart into components, which we're gonna do later on, this is one way of how you can like break these apart into components. So we have a to-do app, which is the outer component, and inside that we would have a list of to-dos, and we would display to-do item inside that list. And we also have a add to-do component at the bottom. So let's talk about like what a React component is. So components are basically functions, JavaScript functions that return JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML. So it may look really similar to HTML. So it basically allows you to write HTML in React. And you can also really easily inject JavaScript code and variables inside your HTML by using curly braces. So if you look at this example here, we basically have this function called myComponent, and it is recommended that you start your that you name your component with a capital letter at the start. So inside this function, we have we're returning a JSX called like hello React, and we're injecting this variable called name into this JSX with a curly braces. So that is how you would like inject different variables inside your HTML inside the JSX. So after you define a function component, you can use it within another components. So if you take a look at this example here, we have a component called greeting, and it is basically returning hello React text in a h1 HTML tag. And we have another React component called app, and it is using this, it can use the greeting component by wrapping it in a brackets. So that is how you would use a component inside another component, and make sure that you close your component tag with a slash if you don't have like a closing tag, right? Yes. So with this method, you can like build a tree of components that define your entire user interface. So what is props? So prop is another important part of React besides React state, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. But prop is just that as any data that comes in from outside of a component. So prop stands for properties, and props can be passed from a parent component to a child component through the JSX attribute, which is similar to HTML attribute. So props come into function components as the first argument to functions. So you can access all the props that are passed in within a function using the props argument. So if we take a look at this example inside the app component, we're using the greeting component, and we're also passing in this attribute called name, and we're giving it a value of React for the first one. And then inside the greeting component, we have access to that name props by doing props.name. So that is how you would like pass in variables from a parent component to a child component. And so this allows you to reuse components with different values, which is going to render different data, like different kind of UI. So in the second greeting component, we have a value of Chris for the name variable. So that's going to display a different type of UI. So state is another type of data for React component. So state is the internal and changeable data for every inside like React component. So you can define a state with the use state hook, which is just a function, and that function is going to return the data and a function to change that data within a array syntax. So if you take an example over here, inside the greeting component, we're using the use state function to create a state for the count, and we also receive a function to update that state, which is called set count. And the 0 that you see inside the use state as an argument is the default value for the count. And we also created a update count function that just increments the count with using the set count function. So we're using the arrow syntax over here. And inside the return, the JSX, we're basically adding a onClick handler that triggers the update count function. So whenever a user clicks on this button, it's going to call the update count function, which is going to set the count state by calling the set count method. So it's just going to increment it, and the count is going to automatically get updated. So you can see how many times a user clicked on this button automatically without having to like manipulate the UI directly. You would have to do that if you were using pure JavaScript using the document object model. So one thing to note here is that you should never try to update the state variable directly, because mutating the states can lead to really odd bugs, and components can be like hard to optimize. You can like read more about it if you were to like Google, and there's a Stack Overflow discussion on this, but just try not to like manipulate the state directly. Make sure that you always use the set state function. And so in this case, that would be the set count function. So yeah, so this is just how this is like the core of React, which is whenever you change your state or prop, your component is gonna get automatically re-rendered, and that is gonna like change your UI. So that's like the really core part of React, and yeah, it just makes things really simple. So one thing that you would really you would come it's like that's like really common is iterating a list and displaying that list of items, and in the UI. So the way you would do that is just looping over that list of array using the map function. Um, so so the map method return like accepts a callback function, and that callback function basically you can like define how to process each item inside the array. So if you take an example over here, we have an array of data, and each data has a title, and an ID. So I think they're like a list of books. So if we want to display all those books nicely, then you would like use curly braces, and then inside that you can like inject your JavaScript code. So in this case, that you can have like um, you can access the props that are passed in by using props set items. And you can, since items is an array, you can use the map method. And inside that, you would pass in a callback function, which I'm using the arrow syntax here. So for each item, I'm just returning a paragraph element. And for the key of the paragraph element, I'm just using the ID of the data item. So this is how you would just iterate a list and display that in your user interface. Yeah. So there are two ways to add styles to your components. So the first way is um, just like importing a regular style sheet. Oops. Yeah. So just like how you would do it in a HTML file, you can just import the CSS style, and then you can use class names, and then just type in your class name, and that would um, and that's one way of using CSS. But as you might have noticed, we're using camel case for the class name because the lowercase class name is a keyword in React for class components. So make sure that you use camel case when you're using CSS classes. But you can also use internal styles inside your React component. So you can just use the style attribute, and inside that, the first curly braces is meant for injecting JavaScript code, and the second curly braces is for a JavaScript object. And React is gonna parse that JavaScript objects and apply the styles similar to how you would do it in a CSS selector. Yeah, and make sure that you wrap some values such as the color hexadecimal inside a quotation, because you're using JavaScript, right? Yeah. The last thing I want to talk about is like how to perform asynchronous functions and side effects. So one thing that you might want to do is calling an external API and get some kind of data and display those data inside your React component, right? So if you want to do that, you need to use the use effect function. So the use effect function is going to take in a callback function that is going to return some kind of promise. So in this case, we're using the fetch API, and we're making a request to this API. And after we get the promise, we turn that into a JSON, which we can read. And then after we get that JSON formatted data, we use that to store that data inside our React state using the set data function here. And then So that's the first argument for the useEffects function. So the second argument is basically an array of dependencies. So if you don't include any dependency, this useEffects function is going to get triggered whenever your component gets re-rendered. But if you were to include some props, it would only get re-rendered if that props is also like has a different value, like if that prop is like updated. So you should always include like any external properties that you use inside your useEffect function in that array of in the like that array, the second argument. Yeah. So and we're just displaying the data that we get from the API inside our JSX. So since we're accessing a variable inside that data object, we need to first make sure that the data object exists because it's gonna trigger an error. Yeah. Okay, so how to get started with a React app? So if you're building a React application from scratch, then you would you mostly use this CLI called Create React App. So it's basically gonna install all the React modules, which is like React and React DOM, without you having to like install them individually. So the command for that is just npx create React app, and then you can specify what folder you want to install it into. So it usually takes about 1 to 2 minutes. But after it is installed, you can cd into your application and just do npm start, and that is going to serve your application in a local host. It's localhost 3000. But in our case, you don't have to run this command since you'll be cloning from a repos which has all the boilerplates already created. But this is how you would go about in like creating a React application from scratch. So before we start, make sure that you have Node.js installed. So this slide is kind of older, and I think the latest version of Node is like Node 12. And I just tried using Node 12 this afternoon, and the application went fine. So you can just use the Node version 12. But make sure that when you like type in node -- version in your command line, a version number pops up. That means you have Node.js installed. And when you install Node.js, you should also, like, it automatically comes with the npm library, which stands for Node Package Manager. So make sure that you also check that, make sure that it is also installed. Do you guys have any questions so far? Alrighty then. Yeah, if you have any question, feel free to post it in the chat box. But let's get started. So you can just visit this GitHub repos, and then just fork this repository by clicking on this fork button over here. And then after it has like completed its forking, you can clone your version of the repos by typing in your command line, which is git bash git clone, and just the URL over here in your terminal. And then after you've cloned it, you can go into your clone directory with cd React Todo-List, which is the name of this repos. And then after that, you need to check out the starter branch by typing git checkout starter. So the master branch has all the finished code inside, but the starter branch comes with the boiler template. And so we're gonna like fill in the functions and other things. And let me know if you run into any issues. One thing to mention is that this meeting is going to be recorded and uploaded on YouTube. So I think I'll like just send out the recording to everyone who attended this meeting in next week or so. So yeah. Um, so after you've done everything over here, you can just install the packages by running npm install, and that is going to install all the packages inside your package.json file. So it should take you about like 1 to 2 minutes, depending on the spec of your computer. Um, but after it finished installed, you can run your application by typing npm start, and that's gonna open up a browser tab, which is gonna be localhost 3000, and you should be able to see a to-do-list UI, but it is not really functional right now. So it's just like dummy UI. So yeah, let me know if you have if you run into any issues. So while it is installing, I'm just gonna go over the packages that we're using for this application. So I've already cloned this repos and I've already like installed everything. So if you've like cloned this repos, you can just go to the yeah. Let me actually go to the starter branch, which I am. Okay, that's good. So yeah, let me just go over the packages that we're using. So if you open up your package.json file, it's gonna display all the configuration and spec of your of this application. Um, so if you go into the dependencies, you can see all the packages that we're using. So we're using React, which is the core library, and we're also using React DOM package, which is gonna allow us to render our React application in our browser. And we're also using React script, which basically allows us to run different kinds of script like this, I think. Yeah, these scripts, which allows us to like serve our application in our browser. And we're also using this package called UUID, which is gonna generate, like automatically generate some ID for us. And that's to keep track of the to-do items. Yeah, someone just joined in. Yeah, let me open up the slides. Um, okay, never mind. That person left. Okay. Okay. So let's see. So let's just go over our application. But before that, let me just run my application. So if you take a look at the package.json, we basically have these scripts, which allows us to quickly run these longer scripts. So if we type in npm start, that's going to trigger the React script starts command. So this is a really convenient way for you to like add different kinds of script for other people who are like installing your app to like quickly run your app. So if we just hit npm start, that's going to start our application in localhost 3000. So I'm gonna be using Chrome browser, but you can use any browser that you like. So this is like what it looks like right now, but it is not really functional. I mean, like we can definitely like check it and have these UI be displayed differently, but we can't really like delete these to the items, and we also can't like add to-dos. So those are the features that we'll be working on. So let's go back to the source code. Okay. So when you're working with a React application, everything that you actually do is like lives inside the source directory. And then, so inside the source, you have this app.js file. But before I go over this, let me go over the index.js. So as I mentioned earlier, React is a single page application. So that means everything lives inside one HTML document. So we're just manipulating the DOM to change everything. So if you take a look at the public directory, we have a HTML file called index.html. So if you take a look at the body tag, you literally have this one div that has an ID of root. So we're basically rendering everything inside this root um, by like putting everything inside this root. So if you take a look at the index.js file, we're using the React DOM package and calling this render method, which is going to render the component that we pass in as the first argument, which is going to be the app component. And then for the second argument, we're passing in like where we want to render this app to. So this is like the entry point to React. So it is like React, like rendering the app component into the root elements, the element with a ID of root. Yeah, so let's take a look at the app.js. So this is the outermost component. So this is like our main component. So we're importing React, and we're also importing the useState hook from the React package. And these are some of the components that we built for this application. So we have to-dos, we have add to-do, and we also have a header component, which is just for like displaying the header text. And we also have some CSS. And we're also using this package called UUID to automatically generate the ID of each to-do. So over here, we have a array of to-dos. So these are the initial to-dos that we're going to populate our state with. So for each to-do, we have a title, we also have an ID, and we have a Boolean variable to keep track of its status, whether it is like completed or not. So by default, it's going to be not completed. So if you look below, we have our component, which is basically a JavaScript function. So I'm using a array syntax over here, but another way of writing this is doing something like, yeah, something like this, that I'm gonna keep it in the array syntax. And then over here, we basically define some functions for, so the first one is for toggling the complete status for each to-do. And we also have a function called delete to-do, and we also have a function for adding new to-dos. And under that, we're just returning a JSX. So we're wrapping everything in a container and a row. So these are all like bootstrap classes, which you don't have to worry about for this meeting. And so inside this container, we basically have our header, and we have a line break, and under that we have our list of to-dos, and we also have a add to-do component over here. So if we were to go back to our application, this is going to be one component, and this to-do list is another component, and we all have a to-do list, add to-do component at the bottom. So we can actually see this by opening up our developers tool. So if you're using the Chrome browser, there's actually this extension called for React. So if you open up your components tab, you can actually see all these React components, and you can also see their internal states on also like other props. So this is a really cool way of examining your front-end application on your browser. Yeah. Okay, let's go back. And we also have our to-do list and to-do item component. Yeah. And they add to-do. So let's work from, let's work on everything step by step. So I think the first feature that we can work on is maybe like creating a creating an internal state to display these to-dos. So right now, it's basically using these dummy tags of do homework, which is like hard coded. So if you take a look at the to-do item component, yeah, so everything is like hard coded for now, but we can actually change that. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create an internal state called to-dos, and I'm gonna have a function to update those state by doing actually let's do set to-dos. Let's call it set to-dos, and I'm gonna use the use state hook. And the default values is going to be the initial state array. Let me, yeah, okay. And then we can just pass these to-dos as a JSX attribute over here. So we can just do to-dos is equal to curly braces to-dos. So that's how you would pass in properties into a child component. So if you can like go inside this to-dos component, and we can get those props by doing by like mapping everything. So let's do that. So we're gonna have a curly braces so we can write JavaScript code over here. And I'm also going to use JavaScript object destructuring to get the to-dos directly instead of using props.to-dos. I'm just gonna get that directly using object destructuring. So I'm just gonna do to-dos. And over here, I'm gonna actually, yeah, let's just remove the div also. So I'm just gonna do to-dos dot map, and then for each to-do, I'm gonna have a callback function, and for each to-do we can return some kind of JSX, the to-do item. So instead of using like curly braces and then doing like return, I'm just gonna use a like the regular parentheses. So what this will do is that it's gonna automatically return anything that is like included in this parentheses, which is why I'm also using it over here. So I don't have to like add the return statement inside this component. So it's gonna like automatically return anything that is included over here. So what I'm gonna do is inside each to-do, I'm just gonna return a to-do item. And for each to-do item, I'm gonna pass in the to-do, and I'm also give it a key because if we don't include it, it's gonna give us some kind of error in the console. Okay, I think this will do for now. And inside the to-do item, we're gonna retrieve that to-do by using object destructuring. And then over here, I'm just gonna pass in the title of that to-do. Let's see. Yeah, I think this will do for now. So if we were to go back to our application, um, okay, as you can see, now we can actually see the to-dos that we've have in our like initial state. So we know that is working, but if we were to take a look at this closer, we can actually hover over to like the to-dos component. And as you can see, it is receiving an array of probs called to-dos. And yeah, you can like literally see everything with this extension. And inside each to-do, we also have the to-do. So we know that everything is working properly. Okay, so now we're able to display the to-dos. So I guess the next thing we can work on is like toggling those to-dos. So what it's supposed to have, like what's supposed to happen is that when we like check this, it should like cross out this text. Um, so I've already like did that in the CSS, but we just need to implement the logic. So what I'm gonna do for now is implementing this toggle complete function and passing that down to each to-do list item. Um, so we basically need to update the completed status of the to-dos with the ID. So in this case, I will be calling the set to-dos function. And I think I mentioned that you shouldn't be like manipulating the React states directly. You should always use the set state function. So in this case, since we can't just directly manipulate the ID, we need to like create a new array because in that case, we're not like mutating any states, right? So in JavaScript, it is recommended that you shouldn't like mutate your variables once you've created them. So what that means is that if you shouldn't like reassign values to a variable, which is really different if you like work in other programming language, because it's gonna like lead to some kind of bugs, which you can like look at more if you were to like Google it. But yeah, remember that you should always use the set state function to update the state. So in this case, what we want to do is that we want to like change the completed status from false to true or true to false of the to-do item that we have uh, that corresponds to this ID. So we're gonna create a new array using JavaScript array literal. So we're gonna use the dot 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 syntax and just construct a new array. So we're gonna we're gonna use the existing to-dos state and we're gonna use a map function. So we're just gonna, so the map function returns a new array after we process like each item within the source array. So inside the map function, we have access to the to-do, and inside that, we're just gonna process if the to-do.id is equal to the ID that we have in our arguments. And then if that is true, then I'm just gonna set to-do.complete equal to to-do dot. So I'm just gonna inverse the completed status. Let's see what it's warning me for. Mm. Um, Yeah, I don't know what this warning is about. Yeah, anyway, yeah, so after we've manipulated this to-dos, then we can just return the to-do like this. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to pass this function down to our child component. So we can pass that into the to-dos item. So let's just do toggle complete is equal to toggle complete. And then we can go inside our to-dos list, and then we can pass that down to the child to the item component. And we also need to accept it, of course. Okay, let's go inside the to-do item. Let's get that prop. Okay, so now we just need to add a unchanged handler for this input element over here. So what this is, so this is basically gonna trigger invoke this toggle complete function whenever there's some changes in this input element. So we can do it by just calling, giving it a function as an argument, and then we can call this toggle complete. And we need to pass in the to-do.id. Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's see. Yeah, let's see what this looks like. Okay, so it's not working, but I think we're able to like update the complete status just fine. So let's check over here. So this is the first to do. Yeah, it is updating. See, it's false right now, but it has turned true. Okay, so we know that our logic is working fine, but we're not seeing the CSS. So let's see where that is. Oh, okay. So we have this function over here that basically returns a JavaScript object. So I guess what we can do is we can like dynamically define the value of the text decoration value by doing if the to-do is completed, sorry, if to-do is completed, then we can give it a value of line through, but if not, then we can just give it a value of none. And make sure you add a quotation, sorry, comma over here. Let's see why it is giving us this warning. So unresolved variable. I mean, we do have our to-dos over here, so it should be fine. Yeah, let's see if this works. Interesting. Oh, let's see. Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, thank you for noticing that, Ben. Okay, all right, so yeah, we know that this is working. So we're able to update, like cross out the to-dos by checking them. So that's good. So the next thing we can work on is adding a new to-do. So let's go back to our app.js file. So this is the function that we need to work on. So we're literally just creating a new JavaScript object for the new to-do using the title, and then we're passing in as an item, as an like we're passing in as an element to our to-dos array. So let's work on that. So let's create a new to-do, which is going to be an object. And then for the ID, we're just going to generate that with the UUID. So we need to invoke this function called v4, which stands for version 4, I think. And then we can pass in the title. And then we can set the completed, sorry, did I call it completed or complete? Let's see. Okay, I call it completed, okay. So let's set this to false. All right, so now we just need to use the set to-dos function to update the to-dos elements. So we're just gonna call this. So as I mentioned earlier, we shouldn't mutate the state directly. So you need to just construct a new array. So I'm gonna use the spread operator to first get all the values inside the existing to-dos, and then at the end of that, I'm gonna pass in my new to-do. So this is just gonna create a new array with all the elements of this existing to-dos array, and it's gonna concatenate this new to-do object at the end. Yeah. Okay, so let's save that. So now we just need to pass this down in our tree. So we need to pass it down to the add to do component. So let's just pass it down here. So new to do is equal to add to do. Sorry, it should be add to do, not new to do. Okay. All right, and then we can go inside this function. So I'm going to be using JavaScript object destructuring to get that function that we passed in. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a state for this add to the form just to capture the temporary state of the to do. So I'm going to create a internal state called new to do, and that's going to have a function called set new to do, and I'll be using useStateHook. And for the initial value, I'm just going to give it an empty string. Yeah, so this new to do is just going to accept the title of the to do, right? And then we're going to include a onChange handler, which is going to capture the current state of the to do while we're like filling out the form, while we're like typing characters. So this is gonna accept an event, so we can like capture the value that is like entered inside this input element. So so we're gonna trigger the set new to do function, and it's gonna accept the target.value. So this is going to be whatever the user enters on their keyboard. So it's gonna capture the state like character by character. Okay, so that's cool. So we also need to give it a unsubmit handler. So we're doing that over here. So when the user finishes typing their new to do, they can click submit, which is going to trigger this onSubmit function. So we need to invoke this prevent default function because it's going to trigger the default behavior of submitting a form, which is going to like refresh the page, which we don't want to do. So we're just going to call the add to do function, which we pass down from our parent component, the app.js. So we're gonna call this function by passing in the value of whatever we have in our new to-do state. So this is what the user types in, right? Okay, so we can call this function, and then we need to reset our existing state by giving it a value of like empty string. And then we also need to reset our form. So we can do that by doing e.target.reset. Okay, and e refers to the form element over here. Okay, so let's see if that works. So let's go back. Okay, let's try to type in some kind of to-dos to homework. All right, so now we know that it is working, and we can also check it off. Okay, that's cool. All right, so yeah, we know that it is working. Okay, so the last feature that we need to implement is deleting the to-dos. So it is really simple. So if you go into the app.js file, we're going to be using, so we simply want to remove the to-do with a corresponding ID from our arrays, and we want to like keep everything else, right? So we can use this JavaScript array method called filter, which is going to filter out whatever element that doesn't meet the condition, the Boolean condition. So we can call to-dos.filter, and we can pass in a callback function, and then we can check if this to-dos ID isn't equal to ID. So this filter method is gonna return a new function, new array. So we're basically filtering out any to-dos that, so we're basically like keeping all the to-dos without this ID that doesn't match this ID. So in doing so, we're kind of like removing the to-dos, right? So now we just need to pass this down to our child components. So let's pass it down to to-dos component. And inside the to-dos, we also need to pass it down to the child. We also need to make sure that we accept it in our props. Then we can go inside the to-dos item. And we need to accept it as a prop over here. And then we can add a onClick handler that basically invokes this function, and we need to pass in the to-do.id over here. Cool. Okay, and let's see if that works. So let's try to remove this. Okay, cool. Yeah, so it is working. So if I were to refresh it, and let's add new to-do call to homework, and we can also delete it. Okay, so that's cool. Yeah, so Yeah, so this is a really simple to-do-list application, but we've covered most important stuff about React, maybe except the use effect hook, but this should allow you to like build a simple React application that helps you build a really cool user interface. And I hope you like learned a lot. But if you missed anything, or if you have any questions, you can always like visit this recording, which I'm going to upload to our website at webdvt.org/events. But I'm also going to email it to all the attendees. But if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or post it in the chat box. But with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day and take care. Bye.